this is Nick. Welcome to the back porch. Today, we're going to be looking at a small little book by Thom Rainer. It's called Who Moved My Pulpit? Leading Change in the Church. I had to read this book a couple of years ago for a pastoral ministries class in my working on my Master in Divinity. And this is a great little book. Thom Rainer, he writes, he's written quite a few books. Most of them are pretty small. He used to be the president and CEO of Lifeway Christian Stores, which I worked at in my undergrad years. But I had to read this for a class, and really now as a pastor, this book actually touches on some things even more so than I was expecting before I had to read it for school. The whole point behind the book, let me just read the back of this to you, and then I'll try to find the place in the book where he gives or where this title comes from. It's really great, but he says, Who moved my pulpit? Who moved my pulpit? May not be the exact question you're asking, but you're certainly asking questions about change in the church, where it's coming from, why it's happening, and how you're supposed to hang on and follow God through it. Even get out ahead of it so your church is faithfully meeting its timeless calling and serving the new opportunities of this age. Based on conversations with thousands of pastors combined with on-the-ground research from more than 50,000 churches, best-selling author Thom Rainer shares an 8-stage roadmap to leading change in your church, not by changing doctrine or teaching, not by changing biblical foundations, but by changing methodologies and approaches for reaching a rapidly changing culture. You are the pastor. You are the church staff person. You are an elder. You are a deacon. You are a key lay leader in the church. This is the book that will equip you to celebrate and lead change no matter the cost. The time is now. And so, really, the thing that he brings up throughout this book is, obviously, as a pastor, you can't just roll into a church as a new pastor and just start changing stuff willy-nilly. You just can't do it. I've been pastoring my church now for about 2.5 years. The first year, the only thing different I did other than preach and teach on Sundays, which they were already used to anyway, the only new thing I added was we started praying aloud or reading aloud together a psalm antiphonally, which just means a back and forth reading of the psalms. This is something that the church has done pretty much from the very beginning, and it's really carried over from Jewish tradition before Christianity was founded. So that's the only thing new I did for a year. And then right after my year anniversary, I started preaching through Philippians and tried to do a little bit of things differently, nothing much, but I did ruffle some feathers of a few folks, and a few folks left, and that was really heartbreaking, but it is what it is. But I can tell you, just from being a pastor for 2.5 years, for being a youth pastor for 1.5 years, you can't just roll into a church and just start changing stuff, at least not with the type of church that I pastor. In the Baptist world, we're congregationalists, which means that the congregation has the authority in the church. The local church is autonomous. For our type of denomination, that has led to some issues, but at the same time, there is some perks to that. You don't have somebody saying, well, you can't preach on X, Y, and Z this week because you have to preach on A, B, and C this week. And there's some perks to it. There's a lot of other perks to it, but the great thing about this book is that at the very least helps you understand, one, you can't just roll in and make changes without at the very least considering the church itself. Just because you don't like something doesn't mean that it's bad for the church. It may just mean that it's not something that you would do personally, and I've had that same issue. But I do want to pull this up, if I can find it here, in the book, and I should have found this before I started the video, but I didn't, because it is what it is. But I'm not going to find it, so let me just give you as much as I can remember from when I read it a while back. But essentially, the story goes that this pastor, he starts at this church. He's been at this church for a few years. Let's just say 5 years, I think. I want to say he'd been there for a few years at this point, and he just hated the old lectern and on the platform where he would preach from. Most of us, especially in the South and in the Southern Baptist world, we just call it a pulpit, right? But he didn't like the pulpit. Not that he didn't care or have reverence for the area. He just didn't like the design of the actual lectern itself. And so one week after church, he bought himself a new one and replaced the old one. And in a lot of churches, that is tantamount to heresy. You could easily go up there and deny the doctrine of the triune God and probably get less pushback than doing something like that in many churches in the U.S. today. And so, obviously that's an over-exaggeration, but you get my point. And so he shows up the next Sunday. Obviously, feathers are ruffled because he has replaced the lectern with a new one without getting church approval, which, let's be honest, you don't really need for something like that. And the next Sunday he shows up, and his pulpit, his new lectern, is gone, and the old one has been put back there. And so, according to Dr. Rainer's testament here, or what he says here, the guy walks into the sanctuary on Sunday before getting ready to preach, because he's been in his office all week, he hasn't gone in there, and he just out loud just burst, "Who moved my pulpit? Where did it go?" And that's really where the title comes from. It's funny, but it's got a good point to it. You can't just roll in and just change stuff. I knew a guy that pastored a small church in the middle of nowhere in Georgia, where the lectern and the chairs on the stage, if you think of a traditional old Southern Baptist church, were built by somebody's great grandfather. You can't get rid of that stuff. You're gonna really upset a small town if you do that. And so the great thing about this book, to wrap this all up and bring it back in, is that this book really does a decent job of, at the very least, giving you kind of some guidelines. I need to read it again, basically, because I've been at this for 2.5 years. There's some things that we need to do differently. We've lost some people, but we're also at a great place to be rejuvenated and revitalized, especially after coming out of COVID lockdown stuff. But he goes through this in just 11 chapters. It's about 125 pages total, and he just starts small, right? You not only pray and read through scripture for this, but you also get a few folks in the church essentially on your side. You're not trying to split the church, but you're building a coalition to start making some changes that need to be made. And you have to deal, obviously, with issues with people and everything else. And you also work on, one of them is just called pick low-hanging fruit. There's some things that can be changed that are low-hanging fruit that nobody's going to care about, right? Well, we don't have an outreach program in our church. My church doesn't really do that well. The outreach program that my church used to do is they would have a meal on Wednesday night. People would show up and eat and then get up and leave. We don't have the finances to do that. As great as it is to feed the neighborhood, we can't do that. And people from the church weren't working in such a way to share the gospel with these people. So they come, get a free meal, and leave. And they take advantage of the church, and you don't want to do that either. And so we don't have a good outreach program. For us, that's low-hanging fruit. That's touching the ground low-hanging fruit, and something we need to be about. And so for me, that's something that we've been working on over the last year, but then COVID happened. And so now we've spent 2 months shut up in our homes. So, but Who Moved My Pulpit by Thom Rainer is a great little book if you're looking to lead change in the church. I'd highly recommend it. Honestly, I'd highly recommend a lot of his smaller little books like this for not only pastors, but for deacons in the church, for lay leaders. If you're an elder-led church, have your elders read this book. If you're a single pastor church with deacons and other lay leaders, have them read this book. It's a great little book. And at the very least, especially in small churches like mine, it can help those deacons and lay leaders see, you know what, we do need to make some changes, and here's a good, healthy way to do it. So I'd highly recommend this, Who Moved My Pulpit by Thom Rainer.